Torn from the fiery pages of the mightiest annals of the West comes the supreme saga in the great tradition of frontier drama.
Schwarzes.
He rode a blazing saddle, he wore a shining star.
Hello and welcome to episode 19 of We'll Review It Our Shelves, the podcast where we review the movies on our shelves. Every 2 weeks we'll take a randomly selected movie from our shelves and we'll review it ourselves. I'm Brian Morgan, and joining me as always from the entirely opposite coast is...
Dan Bergman.
Yay!
And there was much rejoicing.
Ooh, and they were forced to eat Robin's minstrels.
Yay.
I know we made a comment about that last time, and one of our loyal listeners, Jeff Edwards, actually responded and said something to the effect of, Dan Bergman, yay! That was one of his feedback, or one of his bits of feedback, rather.
What a nice man.
And speaking of listener feedback, in addition to what Jeff Edwards said on our Robots episode about Dan Bergman, yay, he said also he wants to have a few beers with the Russian duck. He sounds like my kind of squeaky toy. Well, the Russian duck is always available for a few beers and maybe a bit of vodka if you have this thing maybe on your shelf. And that is, I think, the end of our listener feedback for the Robots episode. To travel back in time to our Star Wars The Force Awakens episode, we did get some listener feedback. It's a little belated, but that's okay. So from Tommy Cunningham and Arvin Sansom, they posted a little bit of feedback on our Star Wars The Force Awakens episode. And Tommy Cunningham said, one thing that drove me crazy was, how the heck are you going to build a world-destroying weapon like Starkiller Base that has like 2 or 3 shots? So it drains the sun. Looks like it cost a bunch and took a while to build. What's the ROI on that one? Just something I didn't like. I love listening to you on my long drives. It makes it so much better. And we appreciate you listening. We are great for long drives in which you have nothing to do but try and find radio stations. And maybe you want to fill up an hour or so of your life with Dan and I yakking about the movies that we own. Thank you very much, Tommy. We certainly do appreciate it.
Yeah, that's a brilliant thing to bring up, too, you know, because, I mean, hell, everybody complains about the Death Star and the Starkiller Base, man. We could probably make a whole episode. And if you want to get in touch with this guy, maybe he can join in the conversation, because, I mean, I'm sure a lot of fanboys have a lot to talk about.
I'm sure they do. Actually, I know Tommy. When I retired from the Navy, Tommy gave me a replica of Luke Skywalker's lightsaber.
Oh, wow. That was nice of him.
Oh, it was touching, and it was one of those surprising things where, like, oh my god, this is amazing. And I may or may not have been drinking at the after party, and my brother was in town, and he was sleeping on the hide-a-bed in my, what I call other living room, but we could call it the den, whatever. And my brother-in-law and a friend of mine and I lit the thing up, and we were just swinging it around in the hallway, and my brother threw a pillow at me, and I actually blocked it with the lightsaber, which was pretty cool, because, again, I had been drinking a little bit, and then we were just flinging that thing every which way and having a great time. So, once again, I just want to say thank you, Tommy. I appreciate that.
Now, just for clarification, was this pre-loss of hand lightsaber or post-loss of hand lightsaber?
Post-loss. This was the green one.
The green one.
Yep. This is the ROTJ lightsaber. And from listener Arvin Sansom, he said something he didn't like was Kylo Ren. They couldn't have picked a more horrible actor to play him. He's fine with his helmet on. As soon as it is removed, he is so hard to take seriously. I did respond on our Facebook page. I said maybe The Last Jedi will help. I didn't really know who Adam Driver was, to be quite honest, before The Force Awakens came out. So
yeah, I'm with you on that. I had no idea who he was, and when he precisely, I had no idea, who was going to be under that mask, because I tend to avoid movie trailers and interviews and all this stuff and everything. So when he took that mask off, I was like, "Who's that?"
Yeah, I'm currently on a trailer embargo for The Last Jedi, so
yeah, same here.
I just don't want to see any more stuff.
Yeah.
Arvin Sansom also did say that I love the ending, though. The transition between The Force Awakens and New Hope, I think, is spectacular, given the actual lapse in time and complete overhaul of the movie makers. I did respond on our Facebook page, said it was a long time ago, 30-plus years in actual time. So, well, not quite 30 years. 77 to 2015, so nearly 40 years. So it was, it was almost actual real time, which was pretty darn cool. So
yeah,
that's our feedback from The Force Awakens, and yeah. So in anticipation of this particular episode, where we will be covering 1974's Mel Brooks Western Blazing Saddles, I threw a question out onto the Facebook page and asked if anyone had any favorite parts and if they thought that this movie would stand up in 2017. And we got a few responses, one of which was from a listener we've heard from before, Jeff Edwards, who said, "I think Blazing Saddles would provoke outrage among some people in 2017. Then again, I think shoelaces, canned peaches, and spoons provoke outrage among some people in 2017. And I think that's a fair assessment. So we'll discuss more about that. What do you think?"
Yeah, I would agree that is a fair assessment. The good part of it is that speaking out is much more readily accepted. Because if you have a problem with something, say something. You see something, say something. Problem is, you always have that crowd that just takes it to the whole other level that was never intended.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. All right. And as to favorite part, Jeff also said, favorite part, just about any scene with Cleavon Little. That man was so damned funny and charismatic. I agree. Cleavon Little was very charismatic. He was a dashing young urbanite.
I agree. I just wish he was in more high-profile movies, because it was just one of those things where, you had such a bright, shining example of somebody's work. Sadly, this is the only example of his work.
This is his biggest example. I mean, he was in other things. I looked him up on IMDb, but nothing on the scale of this as far as public release and widespread notoriety, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I if you ask me, I could not think of anything off the top of my head other than Blazing Saddles, which is sad.
Oh, yeah, and I agree. Not until I looked at IMDb did I realize what other things he'd been in. Actually, just looking up some trivia before we did the podcast, when he was cast, they were like, "Oh, this guy," because his delivery and his timing on the lines, it was just sort of a natural, slow, and easy delivery, and they said, "Oh yeah, this is the guy. We got to have him."
Yeah, and I don't know if this is, because this is where the conversation is going to go, so I'm just going to go ahead and put it out there. It's I don't know if this is kind of the racial bias against us, against black culture, but I would say that, he was probably so famous for this role is because he wasn't over the top that you see in a lot of black comedians, especially today. When you look at, Kevin Hart and Eddie Murphy, it's a lot of in your face, very loud, and that's just the characteristics. And for certain things it works, it makes them funny, and that's why they are so famous and great and in a lot of movies. And I don't disagree with that. I love Kevin Hart and everything like that. But I think for this role, I don't think that type of comedy would have worked. And I think that's what you're kind of putting out there, is that he was smooth, he was kind of demure about his delivery.
I think he was the perfect guy for this, because originally they were considering casting Richard Pryor, and he had a hand in writing this movie. And I don't know, I mean, I like Richard Pryor, I like his comedy, I like the movies that he was in. I don't think he would have been right for this movie. I don't think this movie would have been the same had he been Bart.
I think you're right. I think he would have been good, but I don't think he would have been as good. And that's the thing. Richard Pryor's problem for this movie is that he's Richard Pryor. He's already got his characteristics. People know him. He's very famous. And that would have overshadowed the rest of the movie, I think.
Yeah, it would have been a Richard Pryor movie as opposed to Blazing Saddles.
Exactly.
And, in 74, I was 4, so I don't know how big Richard Pryor was as a comedian, but I know that he had hit a significant portion of his stride in that era, in the same way that Bill Cosby was big in the late 60s, early 70s for his comedy. I don't think they could have got Bill Cosby for this role. I mean, even if they did, I don't think he would have been right.
Oh, no, absolutely not.
I think they stumbled onto the perfect actor for this role.
I would wholeheartedly agree with that. I can think of no other person, living or dead, that could have fit into this role.
Yeah. So, since we're still on listener feedback, listener JT McDaniel commented on the Facebook page, said, "I'm rather fond of Yiddish-speaking Indians. It can be a little nervous-making when you're the only one in the theater who gets the joke, though. The poster version of Brooks's chief headdress is even more fun with the misspelled Hebrew on the headband. It says Persher El Kasach, and I apologize if I'm butchering that, instead of Kosher El Pasach, which I didn't catch. My Hebrew's a little weak, I admit it. I caught Meshuggah and a few of the other Yiddish references in the scene that he's talking about, but I didn't catch that, so that's pretty awesome. I didn't know that.
Yeah, for the longest time, I didn't really make the Yiddish connection, which is a shameful, because that's my father's half of our family culture. And really, I just kind of took it as them speaking German, because one of the last things he said almost sounds like he's saying Auf Wiedersehen. So for many years, I just kind of accepted that, just kind of I don't know, what do they call that, a Mandela effect or whatever, just where I just accepted it as truth. And that's what it was. And, and that's the thing. It's like, it was absurd that Native Americans would be speaking Yiddish or German, either or. So it still was funny to me. It still was a joke. It made me laugh. It did its job. Kind of looking back, I guess it's even more funny and even more fitting because, Mel Brooks. So a whole new appreciation for that particular part of the movie.
Well, he was famous for doing that. And that's one of the things that I care for about this movie and really most of Mel Brooks's movies is he was not afraid to make fun of everyone. Nobody was safe.
That's what's beautiful about his work.
Yep.
Yeah, to look back at some of his other movies, like To Be or Not to Be, his ability to make fun of Nazis, and especially when Jews were concerned, and to do that in a way that didn't bring about outrage, I think is a sort of talent, if I can use that word, or just capability that just sets Mel Brooks apart from all other comedy writers.
I agree. I think that there are many people who can successfully push boundaries like that, but I think in the history of movies, Mel Brooks is the best example of a producer and director and a comedian, that can push that boundary in a way that makes you look at yourself and still go, that's funny and wrong at the same time, but I get it.
The thing about Mel Brooks is he didn't necessarily push boundaries. He made them retreat by tickling them. Because, you can punch somebody and not move them. And, whether that hurts them or not, sometimes they'll stand their ground. It'll make them push back. But you tickle somebody and they'll start to back up going, get away from me. And that's.
Hey.
And that's, Bugs Bunny demonstrated that in one of his cartoons where, the big villain who was easily 5 times his size and brute force didn't work, so he tried to tickle him, and he was doing I'm gonna tickle you, and the guy's like, get away from me, and fell off the cliff, and Bugs Bunny wins the day, So, perfect example.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that comedy helps us do, is address things that are uncomfortable in a way that, we can kind of laugh and still go, ooh, yeah, you're right about that. Yes, how about that? And I think Mel Brooks was brilliant at that, so.
Yeah, and I think with that talent, and this is kind of jumping to the elephant in the room, how he was able to get away with the liberal use of the N-word in this movie without causing, as we say, outrage.
Yeah, that was actually a conversation that he had with Richard Pryor when he'd asked him to punch up the script a little bit and kind of address that elephant and say, look, this is what we want to do. And they said, and Richard Pryor's like, this is freaking hilarious. We have to do this and we have to do this, and helped him out. So before we get too deep into the movie, I do want to ask the question that we always ask, because we have finished up with the listener comments, and we've also addressed the question that I asked earlier from our listener feedback. But I do want to ask, how did this movie get on your shelf?
Well, this movie has a very long history with me. I remember as a young child, I was born in 1972, which is 2 years before this movie was released. So obviously I was too young to watch it when it first came out. But I had barely hit double-digit numbers in my age when I first saw it. And I remember watching it on regular TV with my brother. So I don't even remember if they left the N-word in. Probably not. But I couldn't tell you honestly if they had or not. And I just remember a lot of it being funny. Maybe on a different level, because again, I was so young. But there was a lot of things that made me laugh. And as I grew up, I remember it's like, I remember this movie. It's like, I haven't seen this movie in a while. Watch it again. So when VHS and then DVD eventually came out and everything, it was just kind of a no-brainer. I had to have it. It's just because it has such a long history with me.
Yeah, I reasonably the same. I love this movie, and I always have. I can't recall for the life of me the first time I ever saw it, but it has always resonated as just an incredibly funny movie. And funny at different times in my life for different reasons. There's a certain ribald, slapsticky humor about it that kind of gets you when you're younger. And then when you get a little older and you see the tremendous satire that this movie actually presents, and you see it for what it really is, a slap in the face of racial stupidity, and how we romanticize the Wild West as this thing like, oh, everybody got to do what they wanted to do and it was great. And yeah, sure, if you were a white guy, and particularly if you're a white rich guy like Harvey Korman was, or Mel Brooks, you got to get away with whatever the hell you wanted to do. Not so much everybody else. And it's emphatically put in one of the lines in the movie, and I know I'm jumping ahead, so we'll come back to this, but when Cleavon Little brings all the railroad workers, all the black guys up to help them build the town, and they say, yeah, all they want is a little plot of land. They say, we'll take all of them, except the Irish. Oh, damn, everybody's getting poked at in this movie. Mm-hmm. So, it really does go to show that everybody gets made fun of, and everybody has their moments where they're set upon, if you will, by the dominant culture. Some more so than others, as again emphasized in this movie by its prolific, I don't know if that's the right word.
Yeah, it's a good word.
Use of the N-word. And there's only one other racial epithet that I recall, and we'll talk about that after I get through how this got on my shelf again. But because this movie has so much history and has so much nuance, I knew when it came out on DVD as soon as I saw it that it had to be on my shelf, and I have the 30th anniversary edition, so it was one of those things. I saw it and I knew I had to have it. So anyway, that's how this got onto my shelf, and I think we could probably start addressing some of the stuff that we kind of started to bring up when we were talking about our history with the movie. Do you want to just speak a little bit more about the elephant in the room that you'd already mentioned?
Yeah, but wow, where to start, man? This is a huge part. I mean, especially nowadays. Like I said, even though this movie does have a long history with me, it's not the first time I ever heard the N-word. At least, like, directly, right there in my face type of thing. I have to say, and it's funny because we prior... okay, I was gonna... Like, prior to this, we mentioned Richard Pryor. We previously mentioned Richard Pryor being part of the...
Sorry, I just got it just now.
We previously mentioned Richard Pryor being pivotal... Call 911, it's a gas leak. Okay, we spoke earlier of Richard Pryor being pivotal.
No, you were right. You had it. You were good.
Being important to the creation of this script.
All right, stop. Now say it again.
We had previously mentioned Richard Pryor being a pivotal... Pivot... We need to leave this in. Okay, I'm just gonna go. It's like we had previously spoken of Richard Pryor being important to the creation of this script.
Yes.
And that is the comedian who I first heard say the N-word. And it was the skit when he was on Saturday Night Live. And amazingly, it was a copy of Saturday Night Live on vinyl. It was my brother's copy, and it had the skit with him and Chevy Chase, and it's a famous skit called Word Association. So people who are either old enough or like to go into nostalgic comedy will know it's where Chevy Chase is doing a job interview with Richard Pryor being the interviewee. And they say, okay, part of the interview is word association. And it starts out, I say dog, you say tree. And eventually it just quickly devolves into racial slurs back and forth. And of course, the last one Chevy Chase throws out is the N-word. And Richard Pryor says a very strong response. And the crowd goes wild. I heard lots of laughter. And I thought, hey, that's great. That's funny. Not realizing why it was funny. Because I was so young. I grew up in Southern California where really nobody really said it. It was not a word that was used quite often. People, here already knew that's not a word you use. Do not use it. And I had to get, talks from my brother and my parents. It's like, no, you don't say that word. Don't ever, it's like, that's just a bad word, And at the time, kids, okay, it's a bad word. Don't say it, because there was George Carlin's 6 words you never say, or was it 7? Seven words you never say, and I guess that was number 8. So when I first saw an uncut version of Blazing Saddles, I heard it again and knew it was bad, but I don't know, maybe that's just what made the movie funnier, because it was something that I knew wasn't supposed to be said, but they're saying it all over the place. So maybe I saw it through different eyes. I didn't know the entire social context of what they were making fun of, and I didn't fully understand the humor until I got much older and started talking with other adults, other contemporaries of mine that spoke of, what Mel Brooks was actually doing, and that what he was doing wasn't necessarily racist, because this movie is very self-aware, and that he's actually making fun of racists, using racism to just kind of hold up a mirror and say, hey, this is what it is.
I think what you said about the movie being self-aware is very important, because this movie goes places that we can't go in normal society. And even in the 70s, this was groundbreaking, aside from something that I'll mention later. It was a very satirical look at the way we view things, and even though it was set in the 1870s, post-Civil War, the dialogue was still modern day, and that was a point. Cleavon Little's character, Bart, was very much the dashing urbanite in a very rustic setting, and he spoke with intentionally. He spoke in the vernacular of the street, of Harlem, I think was what they said in some of the internet sites that I did some research on. But it was important to put that sort of thing in there to make it more accessible, to make it more modern and give it an even more biting sense of satire.
Yeah, I was going to say, not just the vernacular, but a lot of the references, a lot of the jokes alluded to a connection with the 1970s.
And even stuff in history. I mean, there was a joke in there about Jesse Owens.
Jesse Owens, yeah.
Yeah, and for my next impression, Jesse Owens. And they ran off. So, there were a lot of things in there that, were obviously not about the Old West, but it was just a convenient setting to address that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, again, I think the contemporary or just the more modern references was, again, to connect with the audience. Because, if you... And my lack of ability to name a black athlete from the 1800s speaks volumes of that.
I don't think there were any.
Well, there was a number.
No, none existed.
Well, there
were none.
Yeah, okay, I get it. I get it. I see what you're doing there. But it's like a lot of times you'll hear people mention African American boxers who were very famous and had impressive records, but our society largely has no idea who these people are, because of the very systemic racism that our country still possesses.
If you watch the movie, I know I'm going off on a tangent here, but if you watch the movie Harlem Nights, Richard Pryor, Eddie Murphy, Della Reese, who recently passed away, it may have been because she got shot in the pinky toe by Eddie Murphy. But anywho, one of the things they talk about, and this is set in, the 20s, I think, during Prohibition?
I think so. I've only seen it once. It was a long time ago. So either the 20s or sometime in the early 30s. But about that time.
Yeah. But one of the things that they really kind of make a point about is the punch-drunk boxer who, they were betting on, and they were all set up to win the championship or whatnot. But they were saying, he's a black guy, he'll never win the championship. So, when you talk about racism, it was a thing that existed. You could excel in your field and still be oppressed because of the color of your skin, even, 50 years after the Civil War. But, this movie, Blazing Saddles, shines a very comedic light on that. It looks at it and says, yeah, hey, look, you might think this is over, but it's still happening, and we're going to poke you in the eye with it in a funny way. Now, I think that there are a lot of people who missed the point of this as satire, as a little bit of, I think we'd spoken about this before, of looking in the mirror and saying, ooh, hey, ooh, he, yuck. Not quite sure I like who I see. I grew up in Oregon, in a smaller town about 70 miles east of Portland, and the N-word was something that kind of hurt all the time, and it was in the derogatory sense a lot of the time. I moved around a lot when I was a kid, so I lived with some, I don't want to call anybody out, but they're all, everyone that this would affect is passed away, and I don't want to insult anyone in my family, but there were members of my family that used that in the meanest, most vile and vicious way, to the point where, when I was growing up, when I was a teenager in the 80s, if you recall the television show Different Strokes, we were told we couldn't watch that because it had those N-words in it, and they were all dirty and nasty and had fleas and ticks and didn't wash, and we were just not allowed to watch it because of that. Now, I spent a very small portion of my life in that environment, and it was one of those things where I reckon, had I not learned previously, that was for lack of a better term, and I'll bleep this out later, a shitty way of referring to someone, and just, racist in the first place. There's potential that I could have grown up like that, thinking the same damn thing. Thank God, that I had, because that's all it takes is someone to continue teaching that sort of behavior to the next generation for that type of crap to continue. So, again, without, saying who or what it was, I grew up with that kind of crap. And this movie kind of helped me see it differently and just poke at it in a way that kind of let out the horror of hearing that in the first place. If that makes sense. Does that sound like a thing that makes sense?
I get what you're trying to say. You haven't lost me. But like I said, I didn't...
Well, that's good, because I don't want to lose our listeners either.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to pretend to understand completely, because, again, I grew up in a very different environment, and to pretend to understand why someone would be that malicious, in a racist way, it's like I can describe it, I can give it an explanation, sociology wise, type of thing, but yeah, I mean, it's never been me, so I can't fully understand it.
Well, and I don't fully understand it either, because I was taught before I experienced that level of, racism, that it was a bad thing, and I think, I spent a lot of time, dare I say it, watching television and movies and that sort of thing when I was a kid. And I was exposed to a lot of stuff, a lot of television shows that kind of showed you that it was not a big deal. People are people. I mean, especially, let's go back to Different Strokes. I mean, that was a thing. You watch Different Strokes and they were just people. And when I say they, yeah, I get it. You could say they, but my point being is everyone is people. It wasn't a matter of their skin color or anything like that. So when I watched that and saw that, and then I went into an environment where there were people who truly believed that they were inferior, it was kind of shocking. It was just one of those like, okay. That's quite possibly one of the dumbest things I've ever heard in my life. But I was at that age where I could think independently, and I wasn't still being programmed by my familial inputs. So that's kind of where I'm trying to go with that. I mean, it's a thing I heard throughout my entire life, and it just well, when I say throughout my entire formative years, if you will, I get that there are people that think that way. I just don't understand why.
Well, what were you gonna say?
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say again. I guess to reiterate, it's like I grew up in the environment where, and I'm grateful for it, where when this movie portrays people who use it, and in the movie, in those characters' minds, they're using it maliciously, because they feel, oh yeah, this person's inferior, and I'm going to use that word to make it known that he's inferior. It's like I'm going to let him know and everything. But because I'm watching it from my experience, from my upbringing, I can hear them say it and not be angry at them. I can actually laugh at them for being so absurdly backwards.
Well, here's the thing, and I'm gonna call your statement into question only because there are two types of people. Well, there's more than two, but there are two dominant types of people in this movie. There are the simple townsfolk who are calling Bart, the N-word, only because that's what they grew up with. That's what they know. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, there's no other way to refer to them. That's what they are. And then there's Slim Pickens and the railroad guys and Harvey Korman and all that kind of stuff, who are using it as an insult, as a weapon to say, not so much that they're specifically saying it as a dagger, but when they say it, you can tell they're being malicious, and this is a put down. You can see through the movie as the townspeople grow to know Bart and he rescues them, that they might slip every now and again and say it, but they're like, oh well, he's just like us. He's just a guy trying to make his way in the world.
I don't think they say it in this movie, but you'll hear it a lot in today's language. He's one of the good ones.
And it could be that, but I don't think that's what they were doing in this movie.
Oh no, I don't think so. But I mean, I'm just saying that's kind of the attitude you kind of suspect. And it's funny when you say about they let it slip every now and again, as it's the scene right after he saves the town from Mongo, when the old lady who had just previously told him up yours N-word comes to the window, gives them a pie, and it says, well, thank you. Thank you for saving us from that awful Mongo. Well, you're welcome, ma'am. Closes the window. All of a sudden, there's another knock. You will have the good taste not to tell anyone that I spoke with you today.
Oh, yeah. And again, that goes exactly to what the point of the movie is this is just stupid. The absurdity of having to come back and say, don't let them know I talked to you, really drives the point home. So one of the things that I did kind of want to throw in there is, while the N-word is used heavily throughout this movie, they do insult the Irish, and there is the Jewish reference, which we've already discussed. Mm-hmm. But the Chinese get one single insult. That's it.
Oh, that's their cameo.
Yeah, that's your cameo, and which is funny because given the level of impact that the Chinese had on building the railroads in the Old West, I was like, oh, that's your one. Yeah, that's all you get. From a historical standpoint, obviously inaccurate. I think, again, from a self-awareness point of the movie, I think it was incredibly accurate. It was one of those like, hey, you get nothing. You don't get to get recognized for anything that you did because you're Chinese. So there.
No, but I like to see that both sides of my people, or both of my cultures, were represented. The Chinese on one side and the Jews on the other. It's like, hey, I'm all there.
Look at me, I win.
I win. Sticking it to the man.
Yeah, on a weird side note, and I don't want to spend too much more time on the movie's use of the N-word or society's acceptance of, because I've got two things, and one is a real quick story. Was it a couple of years ago, 2015, I think? President Obama was on a podcast, and he used the N-word. And it was one of those things that drove a lot of people insane because he's the president, and they're like, why is he using the N-word? And I heard about it, I saw the headline, and I went back and looked up the reference to see what the context was and to see what he was talking about. And to me, it made sense in the moment. What he was talking about made perfect sense. And his use of the N-word, while, again, we are conditioned to find it incredibly distasteful, was appropriate for, again, the context of the conversation. And in popular culture, in rap music and in some other music, you hear that word used fairly heavily. But we're sort of conditioned societally to cringe when we hear that. So I was just curious because it was the President of the United States, and I happened to be at Starbucks one day, and I asked one of the baristas what her opinion was on the President's use of the N-word. And this girl was 18, 19 years old, and she looked at me and said, yeah, my friends use it all the time. Never in a bad way. It's just like, my N-word. Oh, okay. And that kind of struck me as odd because, and this goes to my second point, for the 26 years that I was in the Navy, we have always had, and for our listeners, I'll explain the concept. We had a closed-circuit television system called Sight TV, and we would get movies that were distributed by the Armed Forces Entertainment Service, and we could broadcast them on a couple of different channels on the television throughout the ship so that when we were away from home, we would have movies to watch. Now, back in the day, they used to have, the old reel-to-reel films and all that kind of stuff, but we had video cassettes and eventually, I think, Blu-rays or something like that. But anywho, Blazing Saddles would show up on the list, and you could just, get in touch with the guys that controlled the movie system and say, hey, I'd like to watch, whatever movie. But there were a number of commanding officers that I had on different ships that would expressly forbid this movie from being played on board the ship because of its use of the N-word. But yet we could still watch Boys in the Hood or Colors or any one of a number of movies that were, set in the inner city or pick a stereotypical place that would make this a thing where the word would show up. That was no problem. But we couldn't watch Blazing Saddles. And I always kind of railed against that, like, what's the difference? This is satire, and I think a lot of people miss that.
Well, it's to address that, okay, because I want to address your first point, but the second point, when you talk about, how Blazing Saddles was forbidden, but Boys in the Hood was not, or I could probably bring up a number of Quentin Tarantino movies where he's also right now to contemporary times, where he is probably most well known for his liberal use of the N-word. And a lot of people get in debates. Oh, how come he can say it and, other people can't, and he doesn't get in trouble and other people do? And the thing is like, and I hate to say it this way, but I mean, a lot of it is context.
Sure, absolutely.
So that being said, the context in Blazing Saddles is it's satire and it's commentary, which we have used the analogy, it's a mirror. Mm-hmm. And that's what satire does. Satire holds a mirror up to absurdities. And we say, hey, look at this. Now, my analogy on that is if it makes you uncomfortable, then it makes me question where you come from. What experiences do you have that makes it uncomfortable that they're making fun of racists and racism in general? Because, I mean, again, we both agree that this is what this movie does. It makes fun of racism.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so if that makes you uncomfortable, then, that's where I bring up the question, why? Why does it make you uncomfortable? Is there something in your past? Is there something in the mirror that you are seeing that you don't like? And that would be my thought process when somebody forbids this movie. Because in my experience in the Navy, there was no problem showing this on the boat. We'd play the little compact VHS tapes, or was it? I forget which ones, but it was a little mini.
I think it was Super 8.
Yeah, the little mini cassettes.
Mm-hmm.
I forget what size they were. That was so long ago. But, and it's like...
Because you old.
Yeah, because we're old. But yeah, I mean, it's like if you put it in one, I mean, the officers and the captain, they could tap into that one if they so chose, but we had other players. If they wanted to watch something else, they could. Still, put it in, nobody had a problem with it. Everybody laughed. It was a funny movie. No problem. Everything. Sure. So, and I guess, the crew that I experienced, nobody felt uncomfortable. At least nobody expressed any discomfort with the reflection that movie presented. That's how I would address your second point. It's just that you probably had some captains who just was like, oh, no, there's something wrong with that and everything. I'm not going to show it.
Yeah, it always bothered me. It was just one of those things where it made me wonder if the people making that decision failed to see the intense satire and the point of the movie.
Well, they probably did, because again, satire is holding up a mirror, and again, it's a finger pointing at them, because I mean, these again, we talked about the townsfolk, the simple folk, people of the land. basically morons. But no, I mean,
Oh, somebody help that.
yeah. But the thing is, like, when you get someone like that who puts in, New Jack City, Boys in the Hood, or anything from Tarantino, man, though, that is so far removed from that type of person. The urban setting, the people who live in poverty, who turn to a life of crime, that is so far removed from those middle class.
Oh, yeah, because I lived in a small town in Oregon. Like I said, I mean, there's, 12, 14,000 people at its peak. And the ease with which people would just cast aspersions at people was kind of scary. I mean, again, I will be honest, there are moments in my life where I kind of wonder, like, given the more rural setting that I grew up in and some of the experiences during my formative years, it kind of makes you wonder, like, how the hell did I turn out? And again, this is me. How did I turn out so reasonably normal, or at the very least, so tolerant of things? I mean, and again, that sounds kind of self-congratulatory, yippee yay me. But and maybe it's partly because the Navy really, really opened my eyes. They were already open before, but when you go onto a ship and you're just working with a whole bunch of different people, and what their skin color is matters not a whit. It kind of puts you in a different light, or in a different frame of mind.
Yeah. I remember when I first joined the Navy, one of my recruiters, or at least one of the gentlemen in the recruiting office, was a black man. And, when they're talking about what to expect when you go into boot camp, all the different types of people, because you're going to meet people from all over the country, And the thing is like, you're going to meet people who have never seen a black person. And again, coming from Southern California, that was such an absurd idea. Like, what do you mean? What do you mean never seen a black person? What planet do they live on?
Yeah, we had, I think, maybe 5 or 6 black kids in my high school.
Yeah, that's the thing. And, you talked about the two different types of people, the malicious ones and the ones that are just simple folk and everything. To me, that's the most dangerous form of racism. The crowd that you'll hear being pandered to on Fox News. It's like, I'm not a racist. I don't hate these people. And you know what? You're absolutely right. You don't hate these people, but you are, and I know people say this in a negativity, but this is the strictest description use of the word. They're largely ignorant of a lot of things in the world, and they simply haven't been exposed. They don't know, and that's where you get the systemic racism, where it's just like, well, if a cop's beating up this guy, well, the black guy must have been doing something wrong. I mean, that's how it is, right? I'm not racist.
Yeah.
I'm not racist, but, he must have been doing something wrong, which, again, that sort of apathy, that sort of ignorance is the more dangerous form. Because, I mean, when you get somebody who's maliciously racist, that's like, yeah, that guy, that's a problem. We need to solve that.
Yeah, that's easy to point out.
Yeah.
That's easy to notice. I agree. The ignorant racists are the most dangerous because they don't know what they're doing. They don't know the damage that they can cause by promulgating or proliferating the stereotypes and pushing something that they don't think they believe in, but they're doing it anyway.
Or even the damage they can be doing just simply by doing nothing. That's the thing.
Yeah,
not saying anything, not doing anything. And again, hearing I'm not a racist. I don't know why I'm being lumped in together with all these people. It's just like, well, I'm not lumping you per se, but you're not exactly helping either.
Yeah, I think, and again, and I come at this from kind of, I mean, I guess is a place of privilege. I mean, I'm a white guy. I don't know how else to say this, but I'm sure that in my life I have done something that was subtly racist. I as much as I don't want to admit that sort of thing, I'm sure that I've put myself in a position where somebody thought that I was doing something racist, and I like to think that what I do is predicated on the individual and not their genetic makeup. I have always tried, and I don't know why I feel the need to justify this or say it, and this might get edited out, but I have always tried to judge the individual based on their merits in the way that I would want myself to be judged.
Yeah.
I don't think that anybody can do anything more or less better than anybody. I think anyone is capable of doing anything. Some people just don't want to, and it's not limited to any race or creed or color or religion or any of that crap. I don't understand it. Even though I've seen it, I still don't get it.
Yeah, but I think right there you use the key word, is that you try. And I think that's a big step for a lot of people, is that they try. For me, I mean, we discussed this when we reviewed Tu Wong Fu. It's like growing up, I didn't know any gay people. So I kind of grew up and developed into kind of a homophobe. And I was pretty horrible to a lot of people. And I know it looking back. It's like, oh yeah, I was terrible. But, things changed and I'm trying. I'm doing my best. I think I see myself as a better person because, I try to look at humanity first before I look at anything else. So
I think that's one of the best things about humanity. And again, it goes back to this movie. It sort of pokes that mirror at you and makes you look at, do I do that? Am I that guy? Am I the person? Am I the innocent townsfolk that is merely using this word as a descriptor because that's all I know how to do? The interesting thing is it does sort of force you to be more self-aware, which again is the point of this movie. I mean, I don't understand how people can not see this for that aspect of it. But there are people who just think, oh, this is a funny movie.
Well, yeah, they're the ones who either bury their head in the sand or it just naturally goes over their head. So it's... Yeah. And, you do your best. You try to help as many as you can. Yeah,
and I think, and to kind of, I really would like to move on to other aspects of this movie aside from just the N-word. Okay. Because it is a...
well, it's, as we described, this is the elephant in the room. I mean, it's like you...
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's how you eat an elephant, is one bite at a time.
Yeah, but, just to kind of, as a final thought while we remain on this subject. So going back to what you were talking about when President Obama used the N-word, and you said everybody went nuts. And, of course, like I said, we spoke about context and everything. But, the fact that he used it and everyone's like, oh, should the president be using it and everything? It just reminds me of Joe Rogan's comedy routine when he talked about the 3 most powerful words in the English language. And I'm not going to go through the whole skit, but, of course, the N-word was one of them. And his description of that, because he actually said it. He said, oh, yeah, that's one of the words. And he said, oh, you feel the tension in the room now, it's like, and that's just me saying that it is a word that exists. And already, already people are like the tension and people are getting upset or they're getting fearful and everything. And, it's like, and again, that's the power that sometimes a single word can have.
Yeah, and it is one of the most powerful words for that sort of feeling. Yeah. That there's that, I don't know, I mean, I really, that's actually all I have to say is that is one of those words that evokes a reaction.
Well, I guess my final thought on this before we move on to the other parts of the movie now, we talk about the funny parts of this movie, which I really would like to get on, because like you said, we do talk a lot about this.
Yeah, this is a comedy.
Yeah, it did make us laugh for other reasons. But the final thought that I'd like...
What is a dashing young urbanite doing? Anyway, go ahead.
My final thought on this is that, it is my belief that there will come a time, as long as we progress in the way, I mean, present administration notwithstanding, that we will progress forward. And there might be a time eventually when somebody utters this word and people will be like, what does that mean? What is that? Because we spoke of... I forget which one it was, where we spoke of archaic words. I think it was coolie.
Yeah.
Coolie that we...
Yeah. It was the ghost in the darkness.
And it's like, it's a word that you mention, and it's like, I don't know, that doesn't sound good, but what does it mean? I think the N-word will eventually reach that status.
One can only hope.
Yeah, one can hope. I mean, right now it is at the status, and go back to Fox News. I remember they did a thing. It's like, what's worse, honky or the N-word? And the internet responded was like, look, if you can actually say one and just have to say the first letter of the other, guess which one is worse?
Yeah, guess which one is worse. Yeah, exactly. Like, ooh, that was rough.
Yeah, that's a tough quiz.
To respond to your statement, and then I think we should probably move on. The fact that the N-word is so prolific in pop culture and in various other things, especially in this day and age of media, and to use the word coolie, I mean, that's, again, I heard it in the 19 episodes that we've done. There was one movie where we talked about the word coolie. Granted, this is the first movie that we've talked about the N-word, but I think that, again, nobody refers to coolie as the C word because that's a different word entirely. You know, it rhymes with the University of North Texas or North Tennessee, I'm not sure. The fact that we refer to it as such, it's still in music, it's still in movies, it's still on television, it's still a thing that is the written word in a way that coolie isn't. So I don't know that that's a fair comparison, but I do agree that I hope that one day this becomes a word like, oh, that's so, archaic, that's such a weird word that people used to use. It is as it was said in the Harry Potter movies, to sort of paraphrase, fear of a word gives the word power. It is just a word, and when we watch it in entertainment as a way that people speak to each other in certain situations, it's a thing that exists. I mean, there's ways that people talk to each other, and for our listeners, there was a certain degree of visual reference there, where there's that sort of shrug, like I don't know what else to say. It's a word, it exists. I'm reasonably certain that I say words that people don't like, and by don't like, I mean I occasionally curse. You may have heard it earlier in this episode. So, I don't know. Anyway,
that said,
yeah. So yeah, that was a long conversation on yawn and word. One of the things I'd mentioned earlier, that this was a groundbreaking movie, and just to really shift gears and throw our transmission all over the interstate, this is apparently, according to some interviews with Mel Brooks and some of the makers of Blazing Saddles, this is the first movie in the history of cinema to have audible farts on the screen. And they were so sure that people would find them funny that they actually turned up the volume in those sections so that they could be heard over the laughter that they were anticipating. Farts are funny, man.
Farts are funny. I remember watching this on the boat, and the entire crew just laughing their asses off. And that's the thing. This is a scene that I have probably seen hundreds of times before that moment. But then laughter is infectious. And watching them laugh made me laugh. It just was hard, and it was a harder laugh than I ever laughed at that scene. And now I still laugh at that scene with that memory of that laughter. So yeah, I believe it. If it's the first audible fart in a movie, great. I didn't know that.
Breaking
wind breaking.
Yes, groundbreaking wind.
Oh, so juvenile.
Well, sometimes you have to embrace the inner 12 to 14-year-old. It's kind of like watching the Transformers movies. With the Michael Bay crap, they're garbage movies with zero plot, but ultimately the 12 to 14-year-olds like giant robots are beating each other up.
Oh yeah, I think my cousin Lynn, if you're listening, you're getting credit for this. She said it best when we saw it, and I said, "Oh, that was a man's movie," and she goes, "No, it wasn't. It was a boy's movie." I'm like,
yeah, no kidding.
I can't argue with that. You got a point. But it's funny we talk about the fart jokes and the laughter and the juvenile humor, or as they call it, toilet humor or whatever. I've heard many people say, and using this movie on social media to make a statement, because a lot of people believe PC culture is out of control. Oh, we shouldn't be PC anymore. That's why I voted for so-and-so, because he's not PC. There's the claim that Blazing Saddles could not be made in this day and age. So I pose that question to you.
I think I'll tell you how I think. The listener comments that we had earlier kind of really succinctly captured my opinion on this. I think he could make it today, but I think that there would be a vocal minority that would get offended by it in much the same way as they would shoelaces or peaches or any other damn thing under the sun. I do think this movie could be made today. What I don't know is that a major movie production house or whatever would be willing to, because they want these days, it seems, to put out a formulaic movie that's going to make some money and a lot of the big houses are very risk averse when it comes to putting something like this out. I think they might do it for limited distribution just to see how it goes. I mean, even in 1974, this wasn't released to great fanfare. They didn't have a lot of advertisement. In fact, I don't think they had much of any. And it was just sort of released, and it captured people's imaginations. So I think it could be made in the same way, because I'm Gonna Get You, Sucker, which, I mean, that movie's 20 years old, is functionally very similar. It makes fun of a lot of stereotypes, and it puts things in a way that some people, that people can laugh at and yet still go, oh, okay, that's funny because it's wrong, and that sort of thing. I think it would probably be a little more in your face to sort of make the point, because that seems to be what we're doing nowadays with movies like that. But I think it could be. I know a lot of people will argue against that, and I know this is, not the popular opinion, but I think it could be.
Yeah, whenever I see someone post on Facebook that today's PC culture run amok, that this movie could never be made again, I look at, like I said, I'm Gonna Get You, Sucker, that's one example. Sausage Party, movie 42, I think it was called, or whatever, which was a skit comedy, but I mean, yeah, it's just, I think it's an absurd notion that this movie could not be made again, and I don't know. Like I said, I wanted to address that because I see it so prolific in social media, and I just think that no, I think you're absolutely wrong. This movie could be made again, not to the same quality, not to the same degree, but as far as the imagined PC culture run amok, yeah, I think that's just BS. So, like I said, I just thought I'd address that to some degree.
Yeah, and that's why I asked the question on Facebook. I was just kind of curious to see what other people thought, too. It's a great question. It really is. And I think every time people talk about not being able to see this movie or whatnot, like, oh, you could never make something like that nowadays. Yeah, you could. There are plenty of movies that come out that are not blockbuster, gotta go see it in the theater type of stuff. I mean, there's a lot of stuff on Netflix that goes straight to Netflix. There's a lot of stuff that is shown for about 2 weeks in the theater, or maybe even a week, or never even makes it unless it goes to a major metropolitan area. I'm sure in Los Angeles you probably get access to a lot more movie choice than I do in the Hampton Roads area. We have a few art house theaters that will show limited run movies and that sort of thing. But, it's mostly multiplexes and second run, cheaper versions of the stuff that was in the multiplex.
Let me ask you this. You mentioned that major motion picture production companies may not risk a movie like this. Do you think Warner Brothers in 1974 took a big risk with this movie?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, I thought they had before, but again, doing some of the research that I did before this podcast, some of the interviews with Mel Brooks on the 40th anniversary of Blazing Saddles, and the conversations about that, the studio didn't really know what they were doing. There is, in the movie industry, from what I have been led to believe by people that I have met in my life that have had dealings with the movie industry, there are certain projects that can be greenlit as long as they are below a budgetary threshold, and they can be done without the big ticket producers, the CEOs or presidents or whoever, giving their approval. So I think if you did it on a shoestring budget, and this movie was made for, I think, slightly less than $2 million, which in the 70s, 74, I think nowadays you're probably talking about 15, 20 million, maybe. I'm not sure about the dollar then of the dollar now, but to make something like this would probably cost you about $20 million, and you're talking about the stars involved and that sort of thing. Yeah, no, I think you could probably get them to buy off on it, but they may distribute it under one of their lesser distribution houses. It's like Disney. Disney created Miramax so that they could make riskier movies in the PG-13 when it first came out, and in the R category, and still not be associated with Disney.
Yeah, I have to say that based on just one simple observation and actually not having any kind of extensive knowledge in the movie-making business, or rather the nuances, if you look at like I said, I own 2 copies of this movie, and one of them is part of a collection. And like I said, there's 8 movies in this collection. All but one are made by 20th Century Fox, except for Blazing Saddles, which is made by Warner Brothers.
And the Warner Sister Dot.
And the Warner Sister Dot. But yeah, I mean, if that, to me, that's, again, I don't know what Spaceballs and Dracula Dead and Loving It were made. I could probably go run up and look to see what movie company made them. But yeah, I mean, just looking at that kind of tells me something that, yeah, there's something different about this movie, and there's something different about the way the production companies viewed it.
I agree, but again, I think they got in under the wire of what would require big studio honcho approval, and that makes a tremendous difference. Here's one of the things that is interesting about this movie, because everyone thinks it's a great comedy and it's a great satirical movie, and a lot of people appreciate it for what it is. It was nominated for Oscars. Madeline Kahn was nominated for Best Supporting Actress. The song Blazing Saddles was nominated for an Oscar. And a lot of people don't even think about that or know it. I mean, to be honest, again, until I started doing the research, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Madeline Kahn getting a nomination for Best Supporting Actress. There is a scene where Harvey Korman is saying, it's like, I'm taking the risk of a certain Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor. You know?
Oh, yeah, they make a joke of it. And again, but it goes back to the satirical nature of this movie. Not only was it poking fun at racism, it was poking fun at the Hollywood industry to boot.
Yeah, I don't know how to respond to that real quick. So, I mean, think about that one.
It just goes to show that nothing's safe with Mel Brooks.
Yeah, it's like you said, nothing is safe, including the hand that fed Mel Brooks. He definitely bit it. Which you can say then, with any kind of reasonable doubt, that, yeah, this was definitely a risk.
Yeah, absolutely.
This was definitely, I mean, he basically took a subject and just ran with it. And again, as I say, of the movies that I mentioned, 12 Chairs, 20th Century Fox, Blazing Saddle, Warner Brothers, and then every other movie I mentioned, 20th Century Fox.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like I said, they were, from, again, some of the research I did, they were basically like, oh, hell no. But some of the stuff in there, like when Alex Karras, Mongo, when he punches out a horse, they're like, oh, that's hilarious, we have to have that. And the rest of the stuff, they just didn't really show them until it was too late. So...
Another Schnitzelgrubel?
No, 15's my limit on Schnitzengruben.
I'm not a Cuban cigar.
And, that was one of the interesting things about the movie, going to the Schnitzengruben scene, and you had mentioned earlier, prior to this recording, you had talked about some of the deleted scenes with Sheriff Bart taking out Mongo, and, they went with the Candygram scene, but there were a couple of different iterations. There was a diving scene and a few things like that. You can see how, like you had said earlier, oh, he's one of the good ones, because he starts to win the people over. And some of it was playing on stereotypes, like with Madeline Kahn's character and the Schnitzengruben.
Oh, it's true.
And then part of it was treating people like humans, and that's how he won Mongo over. You only one not to whip Mongo. Mongo just pawned in Game of Life.
So comes the question, though, when we talked about, the scenes with Madeline Kahn, the late great Madeline Kahn.
Yep.
When we talk about the scenes, oh, it's true, and the Schnitzelgruben, I'm not a Cuban cigar. Is there a time, when stereotypes are actually a good thing?
I think when you use them for comedic effect, like they do in this movie, absolutely.
Yeah, I'll accept that, because, I mean, it kind of makes me think of, I don't know if you ever watched the cartoon series Archer.
No, I haven't.
Oh, well, they're freaking hilarious. But there's an episode when he's dealing with 2 gay secret agents, because he had to pretend to be gay to be the honeypot for a gay spy. Anyways, there was something about stereotypes and everything, and for the most part, in the episode they're talking about, oh, that's just a stereotype, and then he goes, it's like, I got you guys thought you guys said that, that's just a stereotype. It's like, hey, stereotypes exist for a reason, and
yeah, and you've said that before on some of our previous episodes.
Yeah, and it's funny, it's like, I guess, yeah, when to comedic effect, yeah, it's funny. To deny someone a job, not so funny.
Yeah, I agree. And this is where the tricky part of this conversation comes in. And when I say this conversation, it's poking fun at stereotypes and that sort of thing. You can say stuff like that, but you got to know your audience, and you have to know that they know that you're not serious. So I will provide an example. There are many people that believe that women should be barefoot, pregnant, and in the kitchen. So when I was in my mid-20s, I was on a ship, and this was before I met you, but I think I may have related this story to you. I had a female division officer, and she was one of the first female officers on the ship and one of the first women on the ship, period. And we were about the same age, and we shot the breeze, because that's what you do when you're underway and all that kind of stuff. And we had gotten to the point where I could look at her, and she would say something, and I'd say, see what we get for letting you out of the kitchen? And she knew I was kidding. I knew I was kidding. And that was it. That was what you needed to complete the joke. Both parties involved were well aware that neither one was serious.
Mm-hmm.
But I happened to say it one day when there was someone on board, a contractor that was installing some equipment, and she got bothered by what I said, and I kind of tried to make sure that it was clear that I was making a joke, and you could kind of tell if you observed. You could see the rapport, you could see nobody was taking it seriously, it was just banter back and forth. But she pulled me off to the side and said, hey, you can't really say that, that's kind of wrong. I'm like, oh, okay, well, we were just kidding, it wasn't really serious. And it kind of goes to that, if you're gonna make fun of stereotypes, you really need to know your audience. And I think that was one of the things that Mel Brooks knew was what people would find funny. I think it's, comedic genius to write these things the way he did and put them the way that he did in the situations that he did so that he could make the most fun of them and really just mock the stereotypes. So, I don't know. I mean, it's fun to make fun of stereotypes, and yes, I'm sure that for some things, stereotypes exist for a reason. But it's kind of one of those things where you have to tiptoe lightly through the tulips.
Well, I talked earlier about, people complaining that there's too much PC culture and everything. And it's just, my whole thing is whenever I hear somebody say it's like, I'm not PC, translation, I just want to be a rude ignoramus and don't care about anybody else's feelings and just say whatever the hell I want with no consequences. That's the translation I get.
I generally kind of take it that way as well.
And that's the thing. I mean, again, you're hitting the nail on the head when you say know your audience, because whenever I hear somebody say, especially people who are previous military, why back on the boat, we were able to say whatever we wanted to these people, and it's like to my shipmate, I was able to call him all kinds of names and make fun of his weight and this and that, and I'm like, well, see, you're missing the point. Is again, you knew your audience. Yeah,
it wasn't like you were just walking up to some stranger on the street going, hey, fetish!
Yeah, we were initiated. We were bonded.
Mm-hmm.
we were a brotherhood, if you say, to use a cliche and everything like that. So yeah, it was perfectly okay to say all kinds of nasty crap to each other because we all knew each other.
Yeah, and through the power of shared experience.
Yeah, in saying that, being initiated and everything, knowing your audience. Obviously, movie makers don't exactly have initiates or fellow initiates or brotherhoods or whatever. I guess that then that's to imply that Mel Brooks knew how to read a room, and when I'm talking like a whole national, if not worldwide, movie audience, which I guess is just my way of praising him for knowing that and being able to make a movie that everybody got, regardless of whether or not they were initiated, at least to an extent that elevated this to cult status, if nothing else.
I think that is something that Mel Brooks well and truly had a grasp of, especially for the times, the 70s, of looking at things in a way that kind of forced people to look at them differently. Some of the other things about this movie is the people that are in it. Gene Wilder, not really at the height of his acting powers. I think he got a lot of the right people at the right time. Slim Pickens, he was pretty well known in the Western genre. Mm-hmm. Harvey Korman, I think he was known well enough in comedic circles, to do what he was doing, to be in this movie, maybe not to carry it as the star, but I think, again, to stay under that, and the budget ended up being, I think, a little over $2 million. I misspoke earlier. But he got the right people in the right place at the right time. And to go back to, could you make this movie nowadays? I think if you got someone like Kevin Hart to play the lead, you would be spending $20 million just to pay his salary. If you got any of, like, Adam Sandler, let's say, to play the Waco Kid, and I'm just, grabbing a name out of a hat here, you would probably pay another, $20 million. So you would already be over budget, and you haven't even paid the salaries of the people that were doing this movie. If it were remade, it would have to be an independent labor of love. Like, I recognize this is going to be comedic genius, and I'm willing to sacrifice my millions of dollars to do it.
Yeah, I really can't disagree with you on that.
Yeah. So what is your favorite scene? I know I'd asked the general public, the wider public, but I don't think I've asked you. What is your favorite scene?
The thing is, like, I don't know that I have a favorite scene. I have a lot of scenes that I will reference. I think this is probably the second most quoted movie in my life.
Okay. Second
only to Monty Python. Even in everyday life, but it's like I was able to use the scene in GIF form. I have a friend at the company, the ambulance
GIF.
company, used to GIF, whatever.
GIF. Anyway, go ahead.
He is one of the few black men that works amongst other EMTs, and one time he posted on Facebook that I'm feeling a little outnumbered, and I was able to send the GIF of the scene where Sheriff Bart points the gun at himself, is like, everybody stand back or the guy gets it, and it's like, stand back, man, he's crazy enough to do it and everything. And that was like the perfect movie reference for the perfect moment,
Yes.
So I like that scene. I like the scene with, the new sheriff is a ding dong. Yes, he's very near,
I like that whole scene. That is my favorite scene, when starting from the sheriff is near until he goes into the sheriff's office and says, breaks the fourth wall, says, "And you are so dumb."
Yo, baby, you are so smooth. And they are so
dumb. That whole scene, I think, is my favorite, because it perfectly encapsulates the stupidity of that sort of thing in the first place. He holds himself hostage, you morons.
I love I got the line, "Excuse me while I whip this out," That's...
Oh, yeah, used that before.
Again, a situation where a stereotype is a good thing to comedic effect.
Yeah. Whenever someone asks me if I would like some more, I usually say something along the lines of, "Oh no, 15 is my limit on Schnitzengurben." So yeah, I quote this movie often. Some of the things are a little incapable of being quoted word for word, let's say. Like, let's just say fill in the blanks, and what the movie I'm saying is, and all that kind of stuff. So
the wagon train scene, I think ranks pretty high. Schwarzes,
Yeah, we in fact, when I say we were behind, we actually forced to make our own circle. Yeah, that's good stuff. I mean, that's just classic vaudevillian type comedy where it's strictly visual, and it carries some of the joke weight on a lot of other things. You couldn't do that with a story. You just like, oh, that's a visual, hilarious.
I hear what you're saying, but when we're referencing that scene, but I think also the lines as well, because here you talking American Indians is another ethnic group that has been greatly disparaged by dominant white society and everything. But then for them to look at a black family and just, wow, they're darker than us. Woof. Just, it's like, wow, even the Native Americans are, had something to say.
And that goes to that entire thing where somebody's going to find something to disparage about somebody else if it, gives them a moment. I mean, that goes to the perfect satire of this movie.
There was something I noticed, though, in the viewing and the preparation for this podcast. There was one scene that I laughed a little bit harder than I ever did at any previous viewing. And it was the scene when Hedley Lamar is hiring all the bad guys. Hedy Lamar. Don't worry, this is 1870. In 100 years, you'll be able to sue her. Anyways, the scene where it's kind of a panning view from, was it right to left? And they're showing all the bad guys. And first, you show some bad cowboys. And then you see the German soldiers and then the Mexican banditos. And, eventually it ends with a couple of Klansmen. Mm-hmm. The funny thing that I laughed at now, because you look at all these bad guys, and they're generally white people. I mean, except for the Mexicans, the Mexican banditos and everything. But just before the Klansmen are a group of, I don't even know what's it called, the Arab, but they're Arabs. They got the long Middle Eastern muskets, and they got a couple camels and everything, and it's like, here are all these bad guys that probably wouldn't have accepted, if it were made today, they probably wouldn't be accepting the Arabs into their group because of the general political climate that we have now. And I just thought it was just so, truth. So you got the white bandits and the German soldiers and the Klansmen, they would not be accepting the Arabs, and probably not the Mexicans either. And so it's funny how even back then the bad guys were more diverse than they are now. Yeah, I don't know. I just thought I'd point that out. I found that very amusing.
That part was also very entertaining, and the part where they go up and they're getting ready to sign the logbook or whatnot. It's like, oh, did you forget to wash up today?
Oh, that's another line that I quote a lot. It's like, hey boys, where are the white women at?
Yeah, and this movie definitely has that quality. It is quotable to a point. There are a lot of things you just can't say.
Yeah, well, know your audience, because to a certain degree, even among other black friends, it's they if they know the movie and they know that that's what you're quoting and they found it funny as well, you can. But like I said, lends to know your audience.
And I think we could probably start moving on. Is there anything else that you want to talk about? I mean, we've really talked about the big piece of the movie, and specifically as it relates to satire and addressing that.
The last thing I'd like to address is, like, we started off, pretty much the beginning of this was talking about the huge elephant in the room, mm-hmm. About the liberal use of the N-word. But the one thing that I also love about this, you really had to, didn't you?
I did.
Okay. But the other thing that I'd like to address about this movie for me, that made it great was also a lot of the subtle humor. There was the mid-range humor that we talked about, making fun of the stereotypes. Oh, it's true. And the cut to the big hunk of schnitzel, that definitely, alluded to, it's like, yeah, it's, I'm trying to keep this a PG podcast, but, you know what it alluded to. Okay. But then there was also all these little subtle things, It's like when the movie, the big climactic fight scene, and then when the camera pans out, and it's like, oh, we're really on the Warner Studios, not in the Old West.
Yeah, I know some people that I've spoken to do not like that.
They don't like that?
They do not like the way this movie ended.
Oh, well, you can't please everybody all the time. But the subtle thing is when it cuts, then you're into the studio commissary. And, everybody who's in costume, and you got the guy, and it's like, it basically accounts for like 1 to 2 seconds or whatever of the whole movie. And it's the guy dressed like Hitler, and it's like, tomorrow we filmed the bunker scene.
What he said was, how's it going? Oh, they cut me after the bunker scene.
Yeah,
like
you
didn't
like
know.
Yeah.
Like you're playing Hitler, but you didn't know that was, the end of his life.
Yeah, and again, a subtle thing, didn't account for anything. Most people would have just ignored it and be like, uh-huh. But like I said, I laughed hysterically at that.
Yeah, I like the end of it. Again, goes to that self-awareness. Like, yeah, hey, in case you didn't know it, we're making a movie. Duh. You know, that was a little bit of very subtle but in-your-face humor. But like, look, we know we're making a movie, so let's just move forward. Because even in the movie, he still shoots the bad guy at the end, and he falls into the concrete and writes his name, Headley. But one of the things that I found entertaining was when they crash into the set of Dom DeLuise's movie, whatever that was going to be. Throw out your hands, stick out your tush, hands on your hips, give him a push.
Yeah.
Cut!
Yeah, that's the other group that's making their cameo, the gays,
Yeah, and especially in the 70s, that was big, that was huge. And especially when one of the cowboys is fighting with one of the gays, and they go under the stairs, and they're fighting, and they come out, and they're like, oh, I'll meet you over at the, and it wasn't just, like, hey, let's go have lunch. It was like, oh, all right, Butch.
Yeah. It's funny because I thought you were going to talk about the thing where one of the showmen, or he's beating on the cowboy's chest and rapping, saying, "You brute, you beast, you brute!" And he starts crying, and instead of the guy taking advantage of it, he just kind of, okay, let it all out. I'll give him a big hug.
Bring it in.
It's like, again, the subtle humor. I love that.
I cared for that a great deal as well, and there was something that I was going to mention, and now I forget what it was. Yeah, well, I'll come. I might remember.
20 minutes later.
I might not. Of course, as with everything. But, yeah, so I liked the end because it really did impress upon you that the movie was incredibly self-aware, especially when they ride off into the sunset, and then they get into a car.
Yeah, into a limo, It's like, and that's the thing. Not only was it self-aware, it didn't take itself seriously. I think that was the big thing for me.
I think that's a key to really good satire, is you can't take yourself too seriously. Otherwise, it just becomes I'm not even sure what the word is.
Then it becomes Fox News is what happens.
Well,
because normally this would be funny, but they're taking themselves way too seriously, man.
But you're reading this like it's a real thing.
Yeah.
And I know I don't want to bash too much on that, but you look at CNN and they take themselves too seriously too. They really do. You're like, okay, look, the other things in the world happen besides X. Can we move on? So that's all I'll say about that. There's a certain self-awareness that seems to be sliding farther and farther away from the center. But going to the idea behind this movie and the fact that it is self-aware, wow. All right, I said the Hitler thing, and it had something to do with the transition to the
Warner Studios.
Yeah, I don't know. A
lot of people didn't like it.
Yeah. One of the other scenes that I found very amusing, and I hadn't forgotten about it, but it was kind of cool to see it again, even though it didn't last that long, was the toll booth in the middle of nowhere.
We gotta get a shitload of dimes.
And one of the things that I did not notice before, but I did notice on this rewatch, was everyone in the town's last name was Johnson.
You never noticed that before?
I never noticed that. I don't know why. Or maybe I'd noticed and forgotten. But when I saw it this time, I was like, oh my God, everyone's name is Johnson. That's funny. But yeah, so Higgins was in this movie, and that was kind of cool.
Yeah.
Oh my God, Magna. He recently passed away, so moment of silence. But it was funny just how many people you see in that movie and go, oh, hey, that's, and kind of move on.
Yeah. The one, though, that always comes up, I'll know it for a little while, then I'll promptly forget her name, but it was the redhead in the governor's office who had the huge tracts of land. Apparently, I guess she was like an adult film star, or at least some low-key.
She was in a series of schlock action movies. In fact, I was going to mention this. I listened to a very popular podcast called How Did This Get Made, if you're familiar with it.
I think you've mentioned it to me before.
It's a couple of two-tree comedians. I mean, they actually have acting jobs or they're in movies. but they take apart crappy movies or movies that are... No, they're crappy movies. It's like, how the hell did... basically answering the question, how the hell did this get made?
MST3K crappy movies,
Yeah, kind of like that. But the lady that played Mel Brooks's secretary was in a bunch of the movies that they covered, and her name is Robin Hilton, and she was in Doc Savage, The Man of Bronze, which I remember watching excitedly. I mean, I loved that movie when I was a kid because it would show up on Channel 12 on the Saturday afternoon matinee. But she was just in a bunch of crap movies doing crap, and I think this was probably the biggest movie that she did.
Huh, interesting.
But I'll be honest, I can't really... I mean, I could think of a whole... I could keep talking about this movie for, well, much longer than I want to record this podcast episode for. So, I mean, there's just so many things you could keep pointing out and wells you could, continue to dive into. So, let's move on to final thoughts. I mean, unless you have any disagreements.
No. It's funny that when we decided that we were going to talk about this movie, it's just like, wow, it's one of the few times where it's like, man, is there going to be too much to talk about or anything? And then the realization that there's going to be one particular part of the aspect of the movie that's going to dominate the entire conversation or anything. But I think we covered a lot without getting too cliched and didn't turn into a quote fest.
Towards the end, we did start to get into the quotes, and I agree with you. But again, in much the same way we did with Monty Python and the Holy Grail, there's some things, you kind of have to quote it just because it makes you think of those things. You're like, it just wouldn't be the same if we didn't. So. Oh,
you know what? Just popped in my head. I know I wanted to talk about this too, and I just totally blazed it until now. Everything talking about the subtle humor. But again, the scene, the fight scene, that Madeline Kahn's character subdued the Germans by getting them into a Oktoberfest type song. Again, a scene that lasted all about 5 seconds, where she's singing. But again, the subtle humor, I loved it. Everybody took care of the enemy in their own special way.
Yeah, exactly. They used their own skills to their advantage.
Yeah. So moving on.
For me, for final thoughts, I gotta say, I think this movie is one of the best comedies ever put to film. I love most Mel Brooks movies. I haven't really seen one that I thought, oh, well, this is complete and total garbage. There have been a couple that were like, ooh.
Not his best work.
Okay, this is not your best. But I still laughed. I mean, Robin Hood Men in Tights, I laughed hysterically. It's still funny.
Yeah.
But it's not his best work.
Yeah, I wouldn't consider it his best work. But, again, it made me laugh.
So, apparently, according to the American Film Institute, this is ranked as the number 6 comedy in the history of American movies. So... it's got something going for it.
Yeah, well, hey.
And it's, Academy Award nominated, so...
Well, there you go.
I don't think we're alone in our appreciation for this movie. But yeah, I love it. I think it's fantastic. Where would you put this on your shelf?
Well, it occupies 2 spaces, because I have 2 copies. One is just in general population, because it's superfluous. I shouldn't say superfluous, but I mean, it just goes. But the box set, because it's Mel Brooks, the special section of box sets of note. So I guess not quite top shelf, but, getting up there, a little higher than general population.
Okay.
It is special, especially when grouped with all its other films.
With its brethren and sistren.
Correct.
For me, this is a top shelf movie through and through. What they did with the dialogue, what they did with the sets, the scenery, the whole shoot match. I agree with what Jeff Edwards said. Cleavon Little is exceptionally charismatic in this movie, and he just draws you in, and he's got that slow comedic timing that not everything has to be quippy and fast. It's just a delivery. You're like, ugh, it's a thing, whatever, and you move forward. Gene Wilder is great in this movie.
The chemistry between the two of them too. It's only, to me, the only thing that rivals it is the chemistry that you saw between Gene Wilder and Richard Pryor.
Yeah, and they had, plenty of movies to prove that chemistry. Some of the best are like Stir Crazy and Silver Streak and things like that. So, but yeah, this is a top shelf movie. I wouldn't put it anywhere else.
I will add that if I ever get a bigger place when I can get more bookshelves and more space for amongst my hundreds, if not thousands of films that I have, I probably would move this to a higher spot of note. Because, unfortunately, lack of space. Movies that should be considered more special have to be in general population. I will add, if given the space, this would occupy a higher spot.
Okay. So, with that being said, we've already positioned this on our shelves. Let's push the magic random movie button.
A Company Man.
Okay.
I don't know that movie.
This is a movie that my wife got. I think it's a Korean movie. I don't know if it's subtitled or not. So this will be interesting. This is, I think, our first foreign film.
Yeah, about to say.
We'll call this our foreign film.
If it is what it is, yeah. We haven't done a foreign film, so okay.
Yeah.
Let's check it out.
So yeah, I've never seen it. I might ask Christy to join us for the recording.
You might have to.
Yeah, because she definitely, the interesting thing about this, from a reviewing standpoint, is we're both going into this cold. I haven't watched this movie. We own it. My wife watched it, but it'll give us an interesting take on this as fresh eyes on a movie. You're like, oh, I've never seen this before. It was actually pretty good, or whatnot. I don't know. So I know my wife likes it, which is again why we own it. So
all right.
But all right, thank you to our listeners for sticking with us, and we're nearing that magical 300 download threshold, and we appreciate you listening. We appreciate your feedback. If you want to get in contact with us, you can do that on our Facebook page. We'll review it ourselves. Just search for that in Facebook. You can email us at wrios2016mr@gmail.com. We don't accept collect calls, but if it's from Bob, we had a baby, it's a boy, we would appreciate that. Dan, did you have a special magic out for us?
Just to say to go do that voodoo which you do so well.
Good, because we hadn't actually quoted anything from Harvey Korman yet, so
I figured to go away from the cliches.
But yeah, thanks for listening, and we will see you in 2 weeks with A Company Man.